which will be discussed a little later on by Peter, was that we wanted to stimulate students to be the future of the discipline, to think about what it means to do research across the intersections of anthropology, art history, and museum practice, and therefore established a junior fellowship between the Research Center for Material Culture and FEL. This has been done for several years now, and we've had outstanding candidates. And again this year, we had a lot of applicants. Unfortunately, we can never honor all of them. We've honored candidates working previously on the material culture collections in the museum, but related to the Sami peoples in the Nordic region. We've had work of students who were doing visual anthropology projects in Ghana, working on the collection, but also all over the world. And this year, we will have similar projects. Normally, we award 4 projects, but we had to award 5 this year because we couldn't choose. And so, this afternoon, I want you to just help me celebrate with Willem van Wijk. Where is Willem? Come. Rab Messina. Is Rab here? Yeah? Come on. Thank you. With Adiva Lawrence. Yes? And with Caroline Caromano. The other person who was awarded, Jamie Comstock Skip, is not with us today because she's doing some work abroad, I think in Istanbul. But one of the things about the projects, you have to go center because we're going to make a photograph. About the projects is how they cover different aspects of the collections within the museum, but very different kind of questions. For example, in Jamie Skip's work, she's trying to explore a particular part of our Persian collection that has never been looked at before. And therefore, it was important for us to invite that kind of project. Willem is going to do something actually really strange because he's going to study, not here, but in Korea. He's going to try and look at how museums there represent particular culture. So we talk a lot about the Folkekunde ethnology model here, but he's going to there to try and understand that. With Rab Messina, there is, her project was particularly interesting for us because her project is around the question of design. And many of you might not know that one of the things that has been impossible for the ethnographic museums for a long time is that they don't use the word design. Design happened at the V&A as the most important design museum in the world. And we who have similar collections think of ourselves as the most important Folkekunde museum in the world. Why is it so that these categories of formation become so separate? And Adiva Lawrence, who is working on the question of the archaeology of Black memory, and who is being invited in a project that she's doing to actually think critically about some of the work that we do here around the questions of the afterlives of the colonial and the present. So I want to congratulate you. And I want to invite you as audiences to actually return, because a part of the requirement of this fellowship is that all of these students will have to present something on their work, what they found out, what the funding did for them. And then we invite you again to listen to some of what they found out. This is the future generation, and that's what is important for us. May I invite Peter Pels to continue the afternoon. Thank you. And I want to say on camera that for those fellows who did not get fellowship, it is not because your proposals weren't good, but because the choice was so hard to just cut it down to 5. But there will be other opportunities. Thank you.
Geachte aanwezigen, dear friends, students, colleagues. Mijn naam is Peter Pels. Ik ben de voormalige voorzitter van het Fonds voor Etnologie in Leiden. En ik ga u kort vertellen waarom ik u hier vandaag voor de laatste keer in de weg ga staan, voordat u van de Gerbrands-lezing kan genieten. For the sake of our guests and colleagues who are challenged by my use of Dutch, I will now switch to English. The Gerbrands Lecture was instituted by the Foundation for Ethnology in Leiden, which also funded other activities that aim to bring the work of Museum Volkenkunde and Leiden University together. These activities included, for example, the installment of extraordinary professorships, only one of which, occupied by my friend and colleague Pieter ter Keurs of the Museum of Antiquities, is still running and will soon stop. It has funded conferences and is still subsidizing research fellowships, helping students and other researchers, and the occasional distinguished fellowship, which brings famous scholars to Leiden for other purposes than a public lecture like the following one. The foundation, however, is facing the end of its financial means and has decided to abolish itself as of January the 1st of this year, since all its financial assets have been earmarked already. These assets have been transferred to the Research Center for Material Culture, which itself is a far more effective organization to bring museum work and Leiden University together. A jury of representatives of the RCMC and of several faculties of Leiden University will continue to award the junior fellowships, those that you have just heard announced by Wayne Modest, for every year as long as the money lasts. The same jury will also consider nominations for distinguished fellowships and continue to bring wonderful senior colleagues to museums of ethnography in the Netherlands for at least some years. And Wayne, can I say something about Ruth? Are you going to do that? Okay. We will have a distinguished fellow soon. Finally, the RCMC will continue to host the Gerbrands Lecture, with only this difference, that the jury who nominated the Gerbrands Laureate, a nomination that the board of the Foundation for Ethnology has always accepted, is now operating independently. And that is why I'm happy to leave the introduction of this year's laureate and the explanation for her selection to the chair of the Gerbrands jury, Mark Westmoreland, expressing the hope that he may do so for many years to come, and saying that the Foundation for Ethnology may be history, but I hope its work may long continue.
While Mark is coming, I just wanted to say that quickly to commit to the University of Leiden that because FEL and the funding is up doesn't mean that the work that we're doing will stop. This is a commitment that we have for a long future because we believe that it is important to do, and therefore the National Museum of World Cultures will continue this work even after that. Our next distinguished fellow, who will start with us in Leiden as of February 1, and she will go for 2 months, will be Professor Ruth Phillips. Professor Ruth Phillips has been a distinguished scholar actually she started out at SOAS working on Africa, a PhD looking at African art, but became, soon after that, one of the most distinguished scholars looking at the art and material culture of native North America. And she starts with us next year and will be in Leiden for 2 months. And the idea is that we open the possibility for these scholars to be available not only to you guys here, but to the field as a whole in the Netherlands. And one of the things that we hope that you'll do is that if you have ideas of people you want to invite, then let us know, because we are interested to service a broader field and not just us here in Leiden as the University of Leiden and the Volkenkunde Museum. Mark, you will not see anything of me again. It is now over to Mark and then to Ariella. Okay.
Esteemed colleagues and honored guests, on behalf of the Research Center for Material Culture and the National Museum of World Cultures, the Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology at Leiden University, the Cineblend Ethnographic Film Festival, and the Fund for Ethnology in Leiden, it is my privilege to welcome you to the Adriaan Gerbrands Lecture. I am Mark Westmoreland, Associate Professor of Visual Anthropology and Chair of the Jury for the Adriaan Gerbrands Lecture. First of all, a very special welcome to Professor Ariella Azoulay, this year's Gerbrands Laureate, whom I will have the honor to introduce momentarily. Her presentation this afternoon will be the 8th annual lecture in this series, named in memory of Adriaan Gerbrands, who was both a curator and vice director of the Leiden Museum of Ethnography, as well as professor of material culture and visual ethnography at the Institute for Cultural Anthropology at Leiden University. The Foundation for Ethnology in Leiden subsidizes this lecture to celebrate Gerbrands' legacy of bringing together the study of visual and material culture by using a combination of anthropological theory, ethnographic methodology, visual representation, and material cultural studies. Each year, a jury of representatives from the National Museum of World Cultures, the Institute for Cultural Anthropology, and from the Ethnographic Festival Cineblend proposes a laureate who should have made seminal and lasting advances in the fields of the study of visual culture, material culture, and museum studies, by scholarly activities, but also by engagement with public debates, museum exhibitions, and filmmaking. The laureate represents an interdisciplinary research field that is relevant to the collaboration between the National Museum of World Cultures and the University of Leiden. Professors Howard Morphy, Faye Ginsberg, Finbar Berry Flood, Christopher Penny, Barbara Kischenblatt-Gimblett, Stephen Feld, Tony Bennett comprise the list of previous laureates. Professor Ariella Azoulay joins this group of esteemed scholars as our 8th Gerbrands Laureate for her own laudable contributions to these academic fields and public engagement. She did her initial academic training at the University Paris 8, the École Haute Études and Sciences Sociales, with several degrees in cinema and literature, semiotics, and interdisciplinary training. She subsequently received her PhD with distinction cum laude from the Cohn Institute for the History of Philosophy of Science and Ideas at Tel Aviv University. She has been a postdoctoral research fellow at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and she has held positions at Camera Obscura School of Art in Tel Aviv, Bar Ilan University, University of Connecticut, Durham University, Tel Aviv University. And since 2013, she has been at Brown University, where she is Professor of Comparative Literature and Modern Culture and Media. She is a prolific scholar with outputs in a wide range of formats. She has translated from French and English into Hebrew several challenging authors, including Balibar, Baudrillard, Foucault, Deleuze, Althusser, and Hannah Arendt. She has authored dozens of her own articles and chapters. She has been invited to give numerous presentations and keynote lectures at many different institutions in at least 20 countries. She has written and or directed several documentary films, and as I learned this afternoon, is working on a new one engaged with museums. And she has written or co-written a dozen books. The impact of Azoulay's work has been profound. She has emerged in the last decade as one of the most creative and forward thinkers of photography. Jonathan Crary has called her the most compelling theorist of photography writing today. Her books, The Civil Contract of Photography, published in English in 2008, and followed by The Civil Imagination, The Political Ontology of Photography in 2012, were game changers in the field of photographic studies. Together, these constitute a large-scale theoretical project that is committed to working with collections of images. Combining visual cultural studies and political theory, Azoulay uses historical and contemporary photographs as sources for narrating the civil history of conflict zones and political regimes, from which she has produced at least 3 significant photographic archives from which her work draws. In the book, Civil Contract of Photography, Azoulay argues that viewing photographs is a civil act that must go beyond frameworks of empathy and aesthetic judgment. Azoulay asks this question: under what legal, political, and cultural conditions does it become possible to see and to show disaster that befalls those who can claim only incomplete or non-existent citizenship? This tome of a book responds to Susan Sontag's important writing on photography, in which she expresses deep concern for the way photography, particularly of atrocities, alienates us from ourselves and from others. Azoulay asks instead, what is the viewer's responsibility to the photograph subject? She does this by dwelling on the gaze of the subject at the camera, not in the assumed desire for compassion, but as plaintiffs enacting the civil contract of photography, which she suggests offers a space for rearticulating political relations beyond the rule of the state. In Civil Imagination, a political ontology of photography, she extends this project. The photograph for her is merely one event in a sequence that constitutes photography, and which always involves an actual or potential spectator in the relationship between the photographer and the individual portrayed. Through photography, she argues that civil imagination seeks out relations of partnership, solidarity, and that sharing that come into being at the expense of sovereign powers that threaten to destroy them. The shift in focus from product to practice brings to light the way images can both reinforce and resist the oppressive realities foisted upon the people depicted. In her latest book, The Resolution of the Suspect, ostensibly a book on the work of Mickey Kratzman, an Israeli photojournalist, photo artist, we may say that this book is actually perhaps less about a photographer and more about a collaboration between Azoulay and Kratzman, who've been working together to some extent for many years. But it's also a collaboration between narrative and images in an effort to forge an emancipated spectator. Kratzman, the Israeli photographer of Palestinians, being the original emancipated spectator of these images, which entails perpetually negotiating a civil contract between himself and his photographed subjects. Apparently, we are not the first tradition of visual anthropology to honor Professor Azoulay. The book won the Robert Gardner Prize, who was a central figure in the history of visual anthropology and is the forebear to today's sensory ethnography lab at Harvard Film Center. In addition to her focus on photographs, Azoulay works with sketches, cinema, and other visual media in order to understand how history is told through visual mediums and how these provide an element unavailable in the written word, whether by its medial limitations or its political censorship. According to Professor Azoulay, the qualities of a photograph include multifaceted or multimodal experiences of this specific event. It's actually...
Beste bezoeker, over enkele minuten gaat het museum sluiten. Wij verzoeken u vriendelijk zich naar de uitgang te begeven. Hartelijk dank voor uw bezoek en tot ziens. Dear visitor, within a few moments the museum will be closed. You're kindly requested to leave the premises. Goodbye and thank you for your visit.
I believe this exact thing happened last year. Actually, there's 2 events. First, when the photograph is taken, and then the reception of the photograph. The act of reception is strikingly accentuated in her book, Different Ways Not to Say Deportation, unshowable photographs. Evoking Berger's ways of knowing, or ways of seeing, I should say, she highlights the kind of restrictions around the way we can look and reproduce certain images. Based on images of the Nakba, the Palestinian expulsion from Israel in 1948, archived at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, which she reproduces photographs as sketches because she was unauthorized to associate the photographic images in their collection with a narrative that challenges the way the Palestinian and Israeli conflict is normalized as irreconcilable. Azoulay argues that in a pre-Nakba Palestine, Jews and Arabs could technically both be called Palestinians, both living on the same land. Such a narrative prevents a binationalistic history of perpetrators and refugees and imagines a different possibility for the present and the future. Whereas the National Museum of World Cultures and the Volkenkunde Museum in particular, like so many ethnographic museums around the world, have taken on the crucial responsibility of decolonizing the museum, Professor Azoulay has echoed these concerns in several crucial ways. An image is always more and less than itself. It can neither be reduced to intentions nor to meaning. As such, Azoulay argues that we need to learn new ways of seeing in order to renew the political potential of images. On this issue, she has advanced a series of responses to the challenge of unlearning decisive moments of photography, unlearning the origins of photography, unlearning images of destruction, unlearning expertise, knowledge, and unsettling expertise positions, unlearning imperial rights to take photographs, unlearning imperial sovereignties. And thus she reminds us of our own unavoidable complicity in these histories of violence. There is no escaping the lasting effects of imperial plunder, but Azoulay provides at least one pathway to potential futures, an idea that she has recently been advancing in her writing. Accordingly, her work responds well to the spirit of Adriaan Gerbrands' efforts to bridge the academy and the museum as sites of scholarly and public education, and his efforts to develop strategies to animate the objects in the museum's collections through both visual representation and personal life stories. Until now, most of our Gerbrands laureates have been anthropologists, many of whom remember Adriaan Gerbrands and have personal stories about their interactions with him. Inevitably, the list of notable scholars who knew Gerbrands is dwindling. But this is an opportunity to push ourselves in new conceptual terrains. How now do we continue to honor the important and influential tradition that Gerbrands established, that which came to be known as the Leiden School of Visual Ethnography? Although I did not know Adriaan Gerbrands in person or in legacy prior to joining Leiden University, I find something incredibly generative in his basic formulations. His combination between different modes of representation and exhibition, namely through the ethnographic registers of object display and observational cinema, necessarily demands interdisciplinary collaboration. Multimodality is not merely diverse material mediations, but equally different ways of knowing and approaching the world. This recognizes the multiplicity of worldviews as well as the frictions in their differentiations. These cannot be reduced to cultural relativism, but are experienced on an ontological level to which the political is an integral part. Learning to recognize these divides, if not seeing beyond them, is of crucial importance. At this moment of perpetual crisis, anthropologists, museum curators, artists, researchers, scholars, students, and citizens of all stripes assembled here today may learn from Professor Azoulay how to further disentangle our own imperial implications in the ethnographic museum and in our practices of looking. To this end, Professor Azoulay will now discuss imperial rights and the origins of photography. Please welcome Ariella Azoulay.
Is there a way that I'll see it on the screen? Okay. Okay. This is mine? Okay, thank you. Okay, good evening. Thank you. Thank you, Mark, for a generous introduction. Thank you, Peter, for sending me the first email of invitation. Thank you, Wayne and Nina, for taking care of my visit and being so welcoming. So what I'm going to present today is based on the manuscript that I completed in the last summer, but it will take 1 year to be published. It's a manuscript that I worked on which I worked for in the last 10 years, and in which what I try to do is to understand in a way the work that I did earlier, for example, on the destruction of Palestine, to contextualize it in the history of 500 years of imperialism, and also to understand the work that I did on photography when I tried to locate the origin of photography, not in the invention of photography by male inventors, male white inventors, mainly in the West. I tried to locate it in the emergence of a community, but I associated it nonetheless to certain technologies of the 19th century. What I've tried to do in the last 10 years is to understand photography in the context of 500 years of imperialism. So I will start. It is no secret that millions of objects, never destined for museal display, have been looted from all over the world by different imperial agents. It is no secret that many of them have been carefully handled, preserved, and displayed to this day in Western museums as precious art objects. And needless to say that I spent the afternoon in the local museum, and it is part of the same story. At the same time, it is no secret that millions of people, stripped bare of most of their material world, including tools, ornaments, and other artifacts, continue to seek a place where they can be at home again and rebuild a habitable world. These two seemingly unrelated movements of forced migration of people on the one hand and artifacts on the other hand, as well as their separation, are as old as the invention of the New World. Here are some museums' records of care for objects that were taken from people who in so many ways were forced to inhabit positions of wordless people, begging until today. And if we think about the migrants or the asylum seekers that are trying to enter Europe, it becomes clear that they are begging until today to find a place in the world that was schemed and organized against them. And let me show you some of the images. You know, I'm going to show the few first images of objects that were taken from the Zulu people, but you know, the Zulu case is just one example among so many others. So what you see here, you know, is a kind of screenshot of the British Museum when you look for objects that were looted from the Zulu people in the 19th century. And when you look at these objects, each one separately, individually, what you see is a real care for the object. Each object is individualized with a tag, with information, with sometimes with drawings that were taken by the people who were involved in the looting, in the extraction of material culture from different places. You have all the information that museums provide us with in relation to images. People and artifacts have become objects of observation and study, conservation and care, command and control by two seemingly unrelated sets of disciplines, institutions, and they are scholars and experts. In truth, however, the two movements are not unrelated. With a certain endlessly recurring brevity, similar to that of the operation of a camera shutter, the unending instantiation of their separation is reiterated. They are continuously produced as disconnected, as if it were the nature of artifacts to exist outside of their communities, as you see it in the way that they are being taken care of by museum, to come into being as museum objects, to be out of reach of those who felt at home in their midst, as if it were the nature of certain people to exist bereft of the worldly objects among which there are inherited knowledge and rights, protective social fabric and safety, bliss and happiness, sorrow and death are inscribed, as if these objects were not a source of worldliness and a fountain of liveliness for the communities from which they were taken. Look at this person and think of the camera shutter. Let us listen, this time not to the image as Tina Kemp proposes us, but rather to the shutter's click. It is a commonplace in the discourse of photography that an operating shutter is necessary for obtaining a legible, sharp, and precise image out of the flow of light. Understood as a subservient element of the photographic apparatus, a means toward an end, the shutter is discussed mainly in technical terms related to the rapidity of its closure, the ability to control and change its velocity, and the swiftness of its performance. The picture to be obtained is presumed to exist, even if for a brief moment, as a petty sovereign. The petty sovereign is not what is recorded in the photograph in terms of its final content or image, but rather is the standalone photograph to be, the image that prefigures and conditions the closing and opening of a shutter. And by this, and I will not have time to dwell on it in length because I want to continue with my argument, but by this what I mean is that these images, the production of these images, add to obstruct from our vision the fact that the Zulu people were not only expropriated and destituted from what they had, but they were also deprived of access to these objects later on kept in museums. And what we have is the production, the simultaneous production of expropriation of objects and abolition of existing system of rights in these places. It commands this kind of petty sovereign of the photograph. In order to achieve this photograph, all of this had to be removed from the frame. The shutter operated this separation. The photograph, as a petty sovereign, commands what sort of things have to be distanced, bracketed, removed, forgotten, suppressed, ignored, overcome, and made irrelevant for the shutter of the camera to function, as well as for a photograph to be taken and its meaning accepted. What is suppressed and made irrelevant is excised by the shutter. In the technological and historical discussion of the shutter, the only elements that matter are the quality, precision, clarity, recognizability of the images, the end product, and the erasure of any trace of the shutter's operation. This is an effect of the means-end relationship between the camera and the images it produces. It also reflects the dissociation of the camera's shutter from other imperial shutters. And by this, what I'm trying to argue is that the the camera shutter is a later invention or a later modification of what became common, which is imperial shutters. These shutters that differentiated people from objects, that differentiated or separated people from their life and transformed them from enslaved people through refugees up to what we call today undocumented. The shutter is a synecdoche for the operation of the entire imperial enterprise on which the invention of photography was modeled. Let me say it bluntly. This photograph could not have been taken outside of the context of an imperial power, which against local resistance decided to open up, with quotation mark, which is one of the most common imperial operations, which is opening up cultures for scholars like us to continue to inhabit these positions. So against local resistance, decided to open up Zululand and wage a war against the Zulu kingdom. Such war was deemed both justified and unavoidable, for, to quote Jan Knight, Zululand was, and I'm quoting, an anachronism, a symbol of an alien and incomprehensible way of life, which must inevitably give way in the face of European-driven concepts of progress, unquote. Anachronism is one of among several common imperial excuses for the destruction of entire worlds, in which worldly principles could impede or resist the relentless expansion of racial exploitation of people and their reduction to labor power that can be exploited and traded. Defeating the Zulu, one of the most powerful and independent African groups south to the Zambezi, was essential in order to make Zululand penetrable for further white settlements, market forces, and commercial exploitation. If the shutter is an imperial apparatus, as I propose here, photography itself should also be understood within the context of European imperialism. In a radical way, imagine that the origins of photography were not to be found somewhere around the beginning of the 19th century, but go back to 1492, the invention of what is called the New World. The idiom New World is not used here only in its familiar spatial and temporal connotations, which are tightly associated even today with the era of discoveries. To resist this commonplace assumption, I understand New World as a configuration of violence that destroys existing worlds of science, activities, and social fabrics, and that replaces them with a new world of objects, classification, borders, laws, technologies, and meanings. And let me dwell very briefly on this image that I brought and the quotation from Hannah Arendt. So let me start with a quotation by Arendt. The discovery of the earth, the mapping of her lands, and the chartering of her waters took many centuries and has only now begun to come to an end. Only now man taken full possession of his mortal dwelling place and gathered the infinite horizons which were temptingly, and forbiddingly open to all previous ages. And this point matters a lot in what I'm trying to propose today in connection to Hannah Arendt is that, you know, the knowledge of mapping, the knowledge of navigating, many different types of knowledges were available to many people prior to the imperial invention of the New World. What was new is this impulse to go beyond some of the prohibition of exploitation, of destruction of worlds. And what we have in this quotation by Hannah Arendt is the understanding that what was available was transformed at a certain moment against what was a temptation for previous generations, but was nonetheless forbidden. So what we see with imperialism is the transgression of what should not be done. And this, I will link it in a minute to what I'm going to present as imperial rights. So just let me finish the quote. He knows, as he knows, the earth as the lines in the palm of his hand. And what we see here in these two images that I brought in the globus and in the earth is this idea of totality that can be mastered from a non-existing point of view. And what we see is that with the production of knowledge, we see the very easy transition into operation, which means from the production of this knowledge that was available previously, we have permission given through charters to people to go and intervene in different places against the local syntax of these places. In a way that this woman would become a Zulu girl, an engaged woman. These images were taken, and here what I'm showing you are images of photographer studios that I produced out of images that are known to be ethnographic images or ethnographic types, images of types. So what I did is erasing the person in order to look at these studios. With very low investment, a camera, some recycled accessories, and an improvised screen, posed in indoor as well as outdoor, photographers could start making their name and glory, sometimes their fortune, often enriching bigger sharks and always taking part in the feast of racial and colonial accumulation on the ruins of yet another culture that has been opened up. In this so-called new world, local populations and resources were assigned specific roles, places, and functions. This is a moment that you may not necessarily know the image, but you probably know of this moment, what is considered to be the inaugural moment of photography when Dominique François Arago presents the discovery of the daguerreotype in the Académie des Sciences. And let me quote from Arago. While these pictures are exhibited to you when he's persuading the members of the Académie des Sciences that this invention should be endorsed by the state, everyone, and this everyone that is from this inexisting point of view, everyone will imagine the extraordinary advantages which could have been derived from so exact and rapid means of reproduction. And what we see here is already what we falsely consider to be neoliberal language, but it is an imperial language, that what matters is the rapidity and the extraordinary advantages for some at the expenses of others. So let me go back to the quotation, rapid means of reproduction during the expedition to Egypt. Everybody will realize that had we had photography in 1798, we would possess today faithful pictorial records, and already the term records as its objectivity, its neutrality, as if in amassing records from all over the world, there is no harm and no violence. So we're actually lost because we didn't have photography earlier. What we could have is faithful pictorial records of that which the learned world is forever deprived of by the greed of the Arabs and the vandalism of certain travelers. To copy the millions of hieroglyphs which cover even the exterior of the great monuments of Thebes, Memphis, Karnak, and others would require decades of time and legions of draftsmen. By daguerreotype, one person would suffice to accomplish this immense work successfully. So what we see here is already what we know, the disposability of people, even among those scholars that were sent or that joined Napoleon in the expedition to Egypt, that were already the privileged, knowledgeable subject. Even there, what we anticipate is their disposability, and of course, the erasure of the point of view of the Egyptians, that for them these records were sheer violence. Photography, though, did not initiate a new world. As you see, this smooth transition in Arago's argument between the Napoleonic expedition and the invention of photography. Yet, because it was instituted in a world that had already been colonized, photography enabled the reproduction of imperial divisions and imperial rights. Let's dwell Let's look for a moment at this image that depict the Egyptian expedition. And what you see here is how mummies were open, how those scholars are working and using the what we would call today cheap labor or free labor of local people who are forced to participate in this expedition of knowledge. And when I'm saying forced to participate, we just have to recall that 5,000 Egyptians who resisted the Napoleonic expedition of scholarship were killed by Napoleon and his army. In images and image-making practices, photography concretized and reified several rights that I'm calling imperial rights: the right to destroy, the right to accumulate, to appropriate, to differentiate the Zulu girl from another one, the Zulu as an engaged girl from another one. And this is, of course, based on the work of many scholars that were part of the invasion of the Zululand. In this case, but as I said, it is just one example among many. So the right to differentiate, to study, to rescue, to record, to document, to salvage, and to exhibit. Photography enabled these imperial rights on the part of colonizers and constituted such rights as given. To take this excursion that I'm inviting you to do with me through photography requires one to abandon the imperial linear temporality and the way it separates tenses and organizes them in order, past, present, and future. One has to engage with the imperial world from a non-imperial perspective and be committed to revoke rather than to ignore or deny the destruction of the world and the manufacture and distribution of imperial rights enforced since 1492. Obviously, we do not have photos from the mass destruction of the late 15th century, nor from the invasion to Egypt, to which Arago relates as if it was a site of extraction. However, filling the blanks with later images of destruction, as I'm showing here some samples, we can understand how the premises of the ideology called documentary, and I'm relating to documentary as an ideology, impedes us from seeing how ubiquitous the enterprise of destruction perpetrated with the help of different multiple shutters has been. And here you have samples, from my computer, a screenshot of different places, such as Palestine, Detroit, Charleston, Aleppo, Haifa, you just name it. Different places in Africa, Asia, Europe, and other continents. For it is imperial destruction, not this or that technological device, the camera obscura, for example, or its products, such as photographs, that should be recognized as ubiquitous. And what I'm trying to do with this idea that photography was invented in 1492 is to change also what we are encouraged or volunteer sometimes to make, which is to introduce precisions, to say that we don't know a world where so many photographs circulate like today in the era of digital media or in the era of social media. What I'm trying to argue is that imperialism was an attack on our perception through the exercise of these rights. sites. So what became ubiquitous is not photographs. What became ubiquitous is destruction, is the transformation of people into disposable bodies. And these imperial transformation that were intertwined with the legal language that we inherited, and we are still working within this language, this impacted our world much more than the emergence of this or that technological device, such as photography, the analog, the digital, etc. Let me show you a few images that are related to Algeria in the context of this invention. So here you have, one of many images of Al Jazeera, Alger. But what I would like to show through this relatively early image, but it is not outside of the story that I'm telling, but what we have here is an image that depicts the city from the outside, from the point of view of the ships that are getting in. The place itself is yet not completely colonized, as we will see with another French expedition that ended up with a total colonization of Algeria. And what you have here is the work by Jean-Charles Langlois, and it is a very early image of Algiers, this time from the inside. You can recognize that the sea is over there and he is already sitting here in this side, which means that he is already permitted to this space that was opened up for his presence with the device, which is the device of the camera obscura, with the help of which he captured. Even though we don't speak yet about capturing in relation to the camera obscura, because there are not yet, available means to fixate the image, but there are already enough means to capture sites from the city. Certainly, if you are already inhabiting a position that was opened up for you by the military, so he's capturing a few dozens of images that he recomposed into a view of Alger that, of course, facilitate the conquest of Alger by the army. And here is one image that he painted of destruction. But as I said earlier, we don't have so many images of destruction, but it shouldn't impede us from narrate the history of the 500 years as a history of destruction in which photography participated. And just let me move to another image in relation to Algeria, and to illustrate through this image, which is again a capture of available images online, to illustrate through this image how much we are not trained to see destruction when we look at images. For example, these images that I would invite you to look at them as images of destruction, because what you have here is the singling out of individual structures, individual buildings, individual precious architectonic objects that were, circulated in the form of postcards in different places, and they are not associated with destruction, but as I'm sure any one of you know in relation to a particular area that you are familiar with, singling out precious buildings of the past, what we called Old City, or what we called Ottoman architecture, what we call, Victorian architecture. It's always the outcome of mass destruction of entire fabrics in order to single them out for them to deserve to be taken in photographs. So the reason that I give you, a manifold of possibilities to look at the destruction is a way that I'm trying to persuade you that even though I don't have images from the 15th century or the 16th century of destruction, we can reconstruct destruction by other means based on different understanding of how destruction leave traces. So as I said, my assumption is that the ubiquity of destruction both precedes and enables the ubiquity of photographs, and not the other way around. The latter is derivative of the former. Here, In these photographs taken a few hundred years after the invasion of the New World, I invite you to see the exercise of these imperial rights that were proclaimed and enacted already in the turn of the 15th century, as we can read in early letters written by Amerigo Vespucci that I'm going to read in a minute. These new rights, whose exercise involved mass destruction, are manufactured under the pretext of the promotion of knowledge involved in the destruction of new worlds, in plural. Palestine also was a new world for some Zionists who decided to destroy it in order to impose the new world upon it. And the right to collect pieces of it and salvage and preserve them outside of the places from where they were extracted. At the beginning of the first of his 4 letters, Vespucci describes that the people he and his expedition encountered gave them, and I'm quoting, "whatever was asked of them, they gave at once, though more out of fear than of love," unquote. Not surprisingly out of fear, not of love, since 22 of them were well-armed men, as Vespucci writes. "Each day," he continues, and I'm quoting again, "we discovered an infinite number of people and various languages until, having sailed 400 leagues along the coast, we began to encounter people who did not want our friendship," unquote. Vespucci and his men continued to fight against the local inhabitants who objected to their invasion until they, and I'm quoting again, routed them and killed 150 of them and set fire to 180 of their houses, unquote. Vespucci concludes the first letter with the achievements of this expedition articulated in the form of the goods they brought back. This harvest is not described as the outcome of the exercise of violence against the indigenous people in the places they invaded. It is instead depicted as an expression of the invader's sharp eye, of his connoisseurship, of what might be appreciated by their sovereigns, and a desired outcome of the right to appropriate others' wealth, resources, and labor. And I'm quoting again from Vespucci. "We brought back pearls and gold in the nascent or crude state. We brought back 2 stones. We brought back a large piece of crystal. We brought back 14 pearls the color of flesh," unquote. Reading these letters outside of the dictate of the temporality of the archive, which is the temporality of the documentary, which invites us to assume that they pertain to an early phase of imperialism, capitalism, or globalization, and instead reconstructing from them the set of imperial rights that continue to lie at the basis of our political regimes, is how I propose to proceed. And here you have one of the objects that hopefully will be part of the restitution if Macron commended a report about the state of thousands of objects looted by the French, if he will follow some of the suggestions of the 2 people, Savoy and Sarr, who drafted this report. Maybe some of them will quit and will be disowned, which is a term that I will discuss tomorrow in the masterclass in Amsterdam, will be disowned, hopefully, by some of the museums, and will find new opportunities to maybe compensate in some ways communities from where they were expropriated. It is well known, so this is an object from Benin, and the reason that I bring it is because I wanted to make the Zulu case just, an example and not the only case that I am showing tonight. So what we have with Benin is a similar story, a story of the right to open up, and not only the right to open up immediately after what was called by the British the punitive expedition, the looting of Benin, the massacre, and the expropriation of these objects, what they initiated, the looters and all the brigade of looters. We are not speaking only on those few faces that were captured in photographs. What they initiated is a new subfield within the already institutionalized discipline that is based on looting, which is the discipline of history of art. And they initiated the field of Benin, but in order for the field of the study of Benin to make sense, the objects had to circulate among imperial powers to be able to be recognized as having a value. So it's true that one of the reasons to sell many of them to others was in order to reimburse themselves for the costs of the massacre. But another reason that I think that we should think about as scholars is how they founded a legitimate field of knowledge, in the name of which objects are still not returned to their places, are still not restituted. And I don't have to inform you about the decision that was taken here in Leiden a few weeks ago. You're probably aware of it, which is short to give any satisfactory future for the people who are claiming the restitution of these objects. So it is well known that these expeditions did not stop with Vespucci. We brought back with much care against many challenges and under well-established preservation protocols, types, precious objects, art, wealth, and destroyed the social fabric, the political formations, and the system of rights and belief of which they were part. Through this combined activity of destruction and manufacture of new worlds, people are deprived of active life and there are different activities reduced and mobilized to fit larger schemes of production and world engineering. Through these schemes, different groups of governed people were crafted and assigned access to certain occupations, mainly non-skilled labor, that in turn enabled the creation of a distinct strata of professions with the vocational purpose of architecting new worlds. Such professions housed experts in distinct domains: economics, law, politics, culture, art, health, and so on, which were differentiated and kept separated under racialized worlds engendered by imperialism. Experts in each domain enjoy the right to shape societies at their vision, or to study these societies or at their will, to study them and craft visionary templates in order to provide solutions to problems generated by other experts in other disciplines. Photography was shaped into such a model with its own strata of experts. This class of experts professionals denied their implication in the constitution and perpetuation of the imperial regime and became quickly convinced that they were not exercising imperial rights, but rather documenting and reporting the wrongs of that regime, acting for the common good. However, in exchange for some of its exclusive rights, not necessarily those that were financially rewarding, photographers are mobilized to represent those imperial rights as if they were disconnected from the regime of violence. And it is out of this structural denial that the tradition of engaged photography, and here you can see some of the most typical, covers of books and catalogs of this tradition, the Concerned Photographer 1 and 2, Face à l'Histoire, etc. It is out of this tradition of denial of their role in the reproduction of imperialism that this tradition could be invented, and the protocol of the documentary vis-à-vis objects that were violently fabricated by imperial power were invented as a mode of being morally concerned with its subjects. And let me show you another set of book covers or catalog covers, this time by Magnum photographers. You can recognize Chim, Robert Capa, Henri Cartier-Bresson, Georges Roger. And what interests me is the way that they divided the world in a similar way to what is known to be the scramble of Africa. So let me read briefly from the website of Magnum. In those days, we are speaking about post-World War II, a photographer had a significant advantage. Large areas of the world had hardly ever seen a photographer. They could choose to go almost anywhere they wanted, as Roger pointed out, because in the early days, one could take pictures of just about anything, and magazines were clamoring for it. Magnum's first move was to divide the world rather loosely into flexible areas of coverage, with Chim in Europe, Cartier-Bresson in India and the Far East, Roger in Africa, and Capa at large, and replacing, etc., etc. Capa was also in Palestine and responsible for the glorifying images of creating, establishing the State of Israel, as if the establishment of the State of Israel was not the destruction of Palestine. So, photographed persons, let alone spectators, provide resources and cheap or free labor for this photographic enterprise, while the photographers act as middle persons between them, the object of their craft, and other imperial agents. In exchange, photographers benefit from the imperial domination of photographic markets and venue, and could claim the right to sign their photographs. Here is another set of images from Algeria, this time of types, and what I'm speaking about is, of course, about the free labor of the photographed persons, but also about the photographers that acted as middle person between those big sharks and the photographed persons, alleviated the violence without even acknowledging, because they acted as if they are the moral subjects, without even acknowledging their own disposability. And what you see here are not images by photographers, because we no longer know their names, those who exercised imperial rights when they took these photographs. What you see are images from Image Bank, this time Alamy, but it could have been Getty very, very easily. So in exchange, photographers benefit from the imperial domination of photographic markets, and just, in the context of Algeria, let's mention Depardon, let's mention Marc Garanger, those French photographers who dominate what we see from Algeria, while we barely know who are the local photographers in these markets. Being provided with the right to deprive other participants from their share in the photograph, the photographers did not enrich themselves necessarily, but enabled large corporations, collections, museums and institutions to benefit from the free labor and from the presence of innumerable photographed persons who fueled the industry of photography. And let me show very quickly some stills from a film by Renzo Martins, Enjoy Your Poverty. I will come back to another set of images from this film later on. So here, the photographer, who is based in Congo, originally from Italy, is being asked about his practice in Congo. I'm from Italy, but I'm based in Kigali. I cover the Congo and the region. So we have this idea of the roaming photographers going, taking their photographs and fueling this industry of news, media, etc. How much do you get for one picture? What we see is that they are participating in the operation of the imperial capitalist, racial capitalist machine, but they are actually being paid very modest amount of money, $50 for a picture. Of course, I have to reiterate, if it was not clear, that they are getting $50 for one picture, which is a very small amount comparing to what they are doing, but the photographed persons are accepted as the free labor altogether. Not surprisingly, such rights that are not inscribed in any community, because when these photographers are roaming around, they are coming to, to Africa one day, the other day to India, which is again such general names for such huge places, but nonetheless, this is the terminology that is used by them and by their agencies. When they are roaming around in between these worlds, they are not embedded in any world. So, their rights are not inscribed in any community or any world, so their rights, those imperial rights that as middle persons they have enjoyed, that enable them some rewards, could be revoked as easily as they are given, and with no remorse. And photographers could always be dispensed with if no longer needed, such as photographers experience nowadays with the mass appropriation of photography by image bank corporations that claim exclusive ownership. As cultural agents, photographers did not enjoy the same privileges as those imperial agents who crafted and distributed imperial rights. In exchange for their privileges and symbolic capital, they were expected to conceal the exploitative meaning of the photographic encounter, an encounter in which those stripped of their rights in their own communities as to become free resources for growing markets, fields of knowledge and disciplines. The dominant discourse of human rights, however, ignores these rights when referring to photography. And the discourse of photography is mostly limited to describing how violation of rights of others, always others, are represented in photographs, others, another name to racial differentiation, are represented in photographs and can be advocated through them, as in Photographic of Human Rights, for example, or to discussing rights pertaining to the end product of photography, the photograph, including rights of ownership or authorship, rights of protection, dissemination, and management. In both ways, such an approach excludes in advance the recognition of the participation of different parties in the event of photography. The right to take photograph is assumed as given, unlimited, and inalienable. Constraints that were occasionally imposed upon this right to take photographs by officials and representatives of imperial powers, such as the army, the police, or the state, helped to shape the persona of the photographer in opposition to these powers, and not as working under the aegis and the protection of the violence these powers exercise. Photographers, like artists, acquired the right to relate to others' worlds as raw material, or in today's language, as references, as material used for study, for admiration or appropriation. Thus, photographers often resist the constraints imposed by the state and its subsidiaries and inhabit the position of freedom fighter of sorts, struggle to keep their right to free movement and speech, and remove obstacles amassed by authorities on the way to pursue their mission. This, however, is usually done without acknowledging, let alone problematizing, the inherited imperial privileges from which the photographer's position is made possible. This is a camera that was shaped by Chaim de Lusky, and what you see here is a camera that has 4 apertures. It is called the north, east, south, west. And then on the image, you have information registered from different perspectives, unlike the ordinary cameras that has 1 aperture and has a very strict divide between those who are in front of the camera, those who are behind of the camera. The cameras are a product of imperialism's scopic regime, but imperial rights are not fully inscribed in the device. The unifocality of the camera and what Chaim Duell-Lusky, who invented this camera, calls its verticality, the way that it is positioned in a vertical relationship to those who are in front of the camera, partition the space where it is located into what or who is in front and those who are behind it. And when this kind of camera, the north, east, southwest, is operated, for example, in a place that the state of Israel brutally divided and brutally reunited in order to keep it segregated, which is called the the seam line in Jerusalem, between East and West Jerusalem, where by the way, Jews and Palestinians lives, in a mixed way, because the idea of racial segregation is always how to keep those who has to be dominated outside, but to keep them also included. So what you have when this photograph was taken, what you have is the registration of information from the 4 different apertures, and you can recognize it very easily if you follow the sun coming from the front. But we have the shadow that should have been on the other side. You have also the shadow of the person who is operating, if we can call it operating the camera, because there is no lens and there is no click, but he is there. So what you see is that information is being able to be registered from a contradictory point of view, or at least in a way that eliminate the unifocal point of view. Photographs are, however, metonymical records of an encounter between those convened around the camera. Even, when you use a regular camera like this to separate the space, the camera is a moment of getting together around the device. Thus, how and who were taken in pictures are dissociated on different levels from what, how, and who are engaged in taking photographs, circulating and holding the rights to the photos as if the photographs were private property. The dissociation is predicated on one of the camera's features, thus belittling the role of its other features, like, for example, to get together around the camera before the space is so binationally, as Mark described some of my intention earlier, before the space is binationally divided. One of the most important of these features, is the opportunity that the camera creates for people to coincide with others in the same space and time, and thus participate in generating something in common that could not be produced otherwise, that is, without the participation of others. It is only through powerful institutions such as museums, archives, the press, or the police, and economic and political sanctions that such other features, as well as the participation of the many, are devalued, prohibited, or outlawed in an attempt to deprive the participants in the photographic event of their rights, making photography subservient to the Imperial project. This is what keeps the unilateral right, the right to roam around with an instrument that penetrates people's lives and to take their pictures without being welcome to do so, on which photography was institutionalized as ungrounded and reversible. And let me show a few more images from Renzo Martin, Enjoy Your Poverty, when he is working in collaboration with 5 local photographers who do not have work, while there is a unity of Médecins Sans Frontières there that is trading with photographs, and Renzo Martin, together with the 5 photographers, are trying to see if local photographers can provide, the thirst for images from Congo, and he tries to train them how to take photographs. So look at what is the advice that not he is giving them, the advice that he gives them as what may allow them to make some money out of their poverty, which means to persuade Médecins Sans Frontières and the media that their photographs may be as important as those of the cosmopolitan photographers. you're too far, get closer. You cannot take photographs of poverty, of misery of others without getting closer. But this getting closer, as we well know, it is not get closer in order to be part of the community, participate in its remedy or in its recovery, but it means coming closer in order to extract their misery and trade it elsewhere. And the woman to whom they are coming closer, please help me, I have 4 children. And now I'm not sure if you can read what is there. I cannot read if I'm not coming closer. I just explained we didn't come here to help people. We just came here to register their problems. This is already what we know as the international imperial language of the protocols of documentary, and this is the guy who ran the Médecins Sans Frontières unit there. You're asking if they can photograph us so that they can sell their photos. He's horrified by this idea that the local photographers will enjoy their poverty rather than the others. I'm not here, and now he's acting as the moral subject. I'm not here to make an exhibit of their misery. It is as if he's protecting the misery of others, but actually what he's protecting is the dissemination of imperial rights among imperial actors altogether. Can be stuck in a photo to make cash? There is no way that I will let it go. To be recognized, a right needs to materialize and to be redeemed in a common world, one which is irreducible to the sheer, always ongoing pursuit to accumulate ever more capital, profit, wealth, distinctions, and power. Not surprisingly, as photographers were and continue to be only minor protagonists in the imperial economy of photography, they often suffer too from its regime of violence, as it destroys social fabrics of communities in which they are or could be part of. It is in those more unusual cases when photography is exercised in concert with the photographers' communities, or at least without the expected alienation from it, that not only is their labor not commissioned by lucrative markets, but additionally they risk losing their immunity. And I'm going to show 2 images from the Great March of Return that is going on, and if you don't know about it, please do the best to get acquainted with it. Palestinians are trying to challenge the border, the siege that is imposed by Israel on Gaza in the last, 70 years, and under different forms. And now the Great March of Return, they are coming on a daily basis to the border, and they are trying to perform their presence there. They are Palestinians. Palestine is there. It's not elsewhere. So no reason to anticipate a solution in the future. They are there. And they are there together with photographers who are part of the community. And what we see is, if you know very well about the photographer that was recently killed, not a Palestinian, because nobody knows about them, in the same time that Khashoggi was killed, I think it was a few weeks ago, a dozen of Palestinian photographers and journalists were killed, but nobody knows about this because they lost their international immunity, because not only they are challenging the state of Israel and the idea of the nation state, but they are challenging the premises of photography, which is the alienation of the photographer from their community, and they are acting as participants in their community. And what you see here is when Yasser Mortaja was killed a few weeks ago, he's carried by his friends, including photographers, which is a community acting in concert in order to claim its right, and not the photographers coming from the outside. And his friends, colleague photographers of Yasser Mortaja taping their mouths with tape. So not only their work is not commissioned by lucrative markets, they risk losing their immunity, not only to be killed, but also not to be mourned by those who are supposedly their colleagues around the world. They become targets for snipers, proxies of imperial agents who seek to dominate a photographic scene that can be generated and by a community under attack. I'm close to finish, but I still have 2 pages, so bear with me. I will cut the end. I know that I'm running out of time. The imperial rights that I have discussed so far are rarely questioned or thematized by those who were socialized to photography in the realms where these rights were institutionalized, such as museums, academia, journalism, and so on. Whenever an objection is raised against the right to exercise photography in an unlimited way that we have seen from Napoleon, from Vespucci on, the story of the Gumtaji clan, for example, discussed by Nicholas Patterson, can serve as an example. The objection remains limited to a single discrete case. The case is interpreted as part of a local narrative and told as part of photography's other histories edited by Patterson and Christopher Pinney, who was here before me a few years ago, as if there is such a thing as an agreed-upon history of an agreed-upon object called photography, and they are narrating photography's other histories. This is a symptom of the persistent failure to recognize the imperial condition and the imperial rights under which photography is practiced, theorized, and historicized. Photographed persons negotiate the best they can, but alone they cannot undo imperial rights. Imperial rights continue to be materialized both despite and through a decreasing presence and often absence of photographers and cameras, which were once thought of as foundational to photography. And just to remind you, the CCTV cameras. This one is from Hebron. Hebron, the place in Palestine that is constantly under destruction. However, even as their labor is made superfluous through image banks, CCTV, and embedded lenses and sensors, photographers do not cease to believe in the semi-mythological role that histories, theories, and institutionally curated collections shaped for them. Their rights are constantly forfeited by image banks and other imperial media corporations, since they were only endowed with their privileges in order to perform their roles in bigger imperial enterprises. That is, until their role too becomes obsolete, like the draftsman that Arago was ready to get rid of. And they could be replaced by different devices, such as their photographs could be acquired freely by mega corporations or at a price that does not even compensate for their labor. However, the progressive description of the diminution of the photographer's role is only partially true. Since the very beginning, photography, a substantial engagement between the photographers and photographed person, even in the condition of the studio, unlike outdoor spaces, was undermined and devalued for the sake of profit, efficiency, speed, and progress, in such a way that the resentment of the photographed person could not even be registered. And just to remind you, this image that you probably know, but to read it under a different angle, which is how profit organizes the situation, the event of photography, in a way that what we see here is an assembly line in the production of photography. When their rights were eaten away, photographers did not give up. They insisted on their rights, thus continuing to accept with confidence the right granted to them by imperial actors, and not to others, namely the right to take photographs of others without engaging with them first and collaboratively setting the terms of the exchange. This unilateral right is facilitated by glorious genealogies of founding fathers, with quotation mark, Bayard, Daguerre, Niepce, Talbot, etc., of the profession with whom they are called to associate themselves. Those genealogies continue to be consolidated through close exchange, or more precisely, through a circular relationship between unbiased in quotation mark, researchers, neutral, in quotation mark, institutions such as museums, and indisputably important collections built by industrialists such as George Eastman or the Getty Institute. The latter, for example, could not have made a fortune outside of the growing market of millions of consumers and the free labor provided by billions of people in the role of extras. Yet, talking about these millions without rights has become a performative trope in the discourse on democratization, with big quotation mark, of the medium, where the category of ubiquity is ascribed to photographs and cameras rather than to the harms produced by the exercise of imperial rights, which also turn these collections into a source of further profit at their expenses. And I will end here. If I had more time, I would speak about a call to photographers to revoke their rights and enable a different use of these depositories. Thank you.
Hello. We have about 15 minutes for questions, if our lecturer would be so kind to entertain. Is anybody?
Thank you very much. I'm actually just really curious about the part you skipped. So, if I may be so bold, perhaps you can give us a little tip, because as photographers in the field, it's such an urgent call to action.
Thank you. When I said that if I had more time, it's not that I complained that I was not given enough time. I was given, I was just, consumed it too quickly. I'll say very briefly, I think that the disavowal of their imperial rights for years, for almost 2 centuries, should be exchanged. Photographers enjoy certain rights, I think minimal comparing to the big sharks who destroy the world. But nonetheless, in these big depositories, I've been just told that here there are millions of photographs that I'm already eager to look at from these, exploitative expeditions. And I'm eager to look at them maybe in order to recommend that they should be buried. I don't know. There are many ways to think about what to do with these photographs. But when we think about photographers, they nonetheless enjoy institutionalized and legal rights in this wealth. And they are very easily expropriated from these rights. And rather than understanding that they were complicit with these imperial enterprises, they are defending their rights, which are the wrong rights, which are the imperial rights, their right to continue to take photographs in an unlimited way, their rights in the photograph, rather than using their rights in order to revoke this system of rights that transform the commons into privatized objects that are very easily expropriated from them too. This is what I can say just now. There are many ways to think about it. I'm pretty sure that I'm not the only one who think about it. What I'm trying to do is part, of a bigger, attempt that today we call it decolonize the museums, decolonize institutions, decolonize photography. I prefer to speak about it in terms of non-imperial or anti-imperial practices, but not in order to argue, because I'm also using the decolonize whatever, because it's very easy for people to understand what we are talking about. So you are already in the midst of the conversation and you don't have to start from zero. The reason that I prefer to think about it as non-imperial revocation of the rights, of imperial rights, or non-imperial approach to photography is because decolonization sounds like something that was started yesterday or 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and everybody feels like an avant-garde. And I think that when we are speaking about revocation of imperial rights, we have to think about a huge movement. We cannot speak about, individual authors or individual photographers who will leave mark on the discourse. And if we want to think about huge movements, why to think in imperial terms only about who we are today or who we recognize as our allies? Since the invasion of the new worlds, people resisted imperialism, which means that they acted from a non-imperial way. So if we consider ourselves as allies with people from the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, without letting these ideologies that root photography in 1839 or in the alternative histories of photography, let's correct it and say it's not Daguerre, it's Bayard. Let's move it earlier to 1837. If we don't let these historiographies, imperial historiographies, to blind us, we can consider ourselves in a different position. And I think that photographers have a lot of work to do in acknowledging their complicity. You cannot start without acknowledging your complicity. And based on the acknowledgement of their complicity, to call for the revocation of their rights, not in order to give them to Getty, but in order to reconsider what should be done with these depositories. And they can dominate the discourse much more than the photographed persons, because their rights were legalized, while the rights of the photographed persons until today are constantly undermined. In my book, when it will come out, there are some calls for strikes. Some of them are based on strikes that are already going on. Some of them are free imagination, but imagination that is completely anchored in struggles that should be pursued. Because if you don't disavow the rights and if you acknowledge your complicity, it is so clear what should be done and what we should disown in order to create space to share the world differently.
Thank you very much for your lecture, but I'm just curious. There are photographers already since the 80s who are trying to acknowledge what you said and what you told us about, and even nowadays, I would have liked you to show maybe one or two photographers who do and who acknowledge what you say and who are doing and behaving in a different way, in a non-imperialist way. Am I correct or no? Yeah.
The only thing that I think that we may disagree is about the chronology. I think that we cannot, or at least I will not volunteer to date anything as something that started in the 80s and to associate it with this group of photographers or with this school of photographers. I think that if we understand that the anti-imperial or non-imperial engagement with the world is as old as imperialism, we cannot assume that it started in the 80s. So for me, it is already imbricated in photography, the other potentialities. So what I'm trying to narrate is a potential history of photography out of which we can see all the time the tension between the two. And I was hoping that I'm showing at least one or two or three examples like this, but they are not canonized photographers, they are not known, they are not mourned, like Yasser Mortaja, for example, the Palestinian who is part of the community, is taking photograph not from an alienated point of view, but completely the opposite, as struggling against imperial forces on different levels. Yeah, but Yasser Mortaja too. So it's not that I didn't evoke again the more familiar names that I appreciate, that I like, that I share. With Susan Meiselas, we are working on a project in the last 7 years called in which we potentialize the history of photography through collaboration with Susan Meiselas, Wendy Ewald, Laura Wexler, and Lee Rayford. We are revisiting the entire history of photography in order to look at it as platforms for collaboration But the idea for me is not necessarily today to be here and to narrate an alternative history of photography in order to save photography out of itself, but on the contrary, in order to create an urgency out of cases that are less familiar and in which everyday people are being killed for exercising photography differently. And the entire community of photography is still based on these premises of the photographer is the single author. And what I think is interesting when it comes to photographers who initiated collaboration as constitutive part of their practice, like, for example, Wendy Evald or Susan Meiselas, the two photographers with whom we are working on this, is that when it comes to museums, their collaborators are not recognized as the parties in this creation, which means that it is not only about individuals, it is about the transformation of the premises on which photography as a field of, as a practice is built.
Ariella, if I may, thank you so much for your talk. I want to come back to a few points that I thought were quite intriguing. Early on in your presentation, you showed these images of colonial era studios, and you've erased the subjects so that we focus on the studios themselves. There's also your attempt to look at various images that we would not readily or initially associate with destruction, that show the various architectural splendor of antiquities in these fragmented sorts of ways. And I'm intrigued to think with you a little bit about the role of the frame, particularly as you come to this this odd camera, northeast, west, south, I forget how exactly it goes, but the four directions. And wondering, I'm not sure if I completely followed your argument at that point, but it seemed that you were suggesting that there was a kind of radical gesture in the use of this camera at this particular site, partly because of what it was doing to rupture our understandings of a photographic frame. And I wonder if you, how you would situate this in dialogue with scholars like George D.D. Huberman, who's been thinking a lot about the role of kind of the excess, in a way, on the outside of the images that have been reproduced of the Holocaust, and in the importance of this sort of frame, or the way Judith Butler has talked about frames of war. But then also bring it back to how would we engage with, for instance, this newer technology of 360 photography and video that seems to erase the frame, and as if there's no position that it's being taken from. What is the role of the frame, and how does it relate to these examples you've given us? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll try to answer one by one your questions. So I'll start with the studio of the photographer. When it comes to what is called ethnographic photographs or photographs of types, what we have is often the discourse, the critical discourse of epistemological violence, that people were created as types. Because we are looking at the frame, we are looking within the frame. And, I was recently invited to participate in a conference. It took, 1 year to work on, to get deeper into some frames that I wanted to explore that came from a collection of photographs from different periods that were actually extracted from Africa today. We're not speaking about extraction always in terms of what happened in the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century. And when I looked at these photographs, I was required to choose some photographs that I would like to write on from this collection. I look at some photographs of children. These are the photographs. And I felt like, It's not enough to speak about the epistemological violence and that they are made into type. Something bothered me as if I'm looking at images of trafficking children. And sure enough, and I'm not expert of South Africa, and I don't pretend to be even now, but I pretend to be capable to intervene in the discourse of imperialism and photography. And sure enough, when I delve a little bit into the history of photography in South Africa, with nobody writing about this, I realized that I was right. I'm looking at images that actually advertise children for to become what was called indentured labor, but it is, of course, a different form of slavery. And why I'm dwelling in length on this, it seems like it is not related to what you are saying. Without this understanding of the shutter, which is not the frame, because the frame, we already accept that what we are looking at is the frame, and we would speak about what is outside of the frame, but this is not enough. When we are speaking about trafficking children, for example, it's not enough to say that the child is depicted without a world, that is barefooted. It's not enough. When I look at the ground of the studios, here you see a rug. I didn't think that I will talk more in depth about it today, so I didn't bring the other images. But what I realized is that some of the studios are in outdoor spaces, which is nearby Kimberley, which is nearby the extraction of diamonds, which is nearby where shortage of labor was felt by those racial capitalists. So this is why these children were advertised as being capable to be the solution for that. So coming back to Didier Huberman or to Butler, I think that, it's not in opposition to what they are doing, but what I'm trying to look at is the operation of the shutter that doesn't invite me to become a scholar of photography, that is expert in frames, that is expert in photographs. What I'm trying to do is to understand the shutter as the photographic shutter as one additional shutter in the history of shutters that were able to transform people into slaves. I would like to create this continuity, and for that I cannot limit myself to what is considered to be part of the frame or part of what creates my allegedly field of expertise. I deny this field of expertise of mine as photography. And coming back to the images of Chaim Tuweluski or to this attempt to create different types of cameras, yes, I don't present it as, the ultimate solution to all the evils of imperialism. This is why none of the photographic projects can be for me, this is the right way to do. The idea is how to mobilize to our imagination different practices to challenge different attempts to challenge many of the premises of imperialism. And here what we have is a combination of a challenge to the invention of photography as a unifocal view of the world that is so linked to the separation of population, to partitioning of different places, to the exploitation of one people at the expenses for the benefit of others. So here we have a challenge of the history of photography, in the same time that we have a challenge of the nation-state discourse or imperial sovereignty discourse. So yeah, I brought it not as the ultimate answer, but as one among many attempts to question this. But I'm not sure if I answered all your questions, but...
Well, thank you so much. We will have a reception, so if anybody has lingering questions, you can talk with Professor Azoulay downstairs. Perhaps if you go down the stairs, you know where the cafe is. We'll have the reception there. It will last until 7. I hope you all join us. And once again, a round of applause, please, for Professor Azoulay.